You're listening to Stranger Than Fiction, Corruption and Crimes Against Humanity in the COVID Era, an audiobook by N.B. Austin. This is a free audiobook, but if you enjoy what you're listening to, you'd like to cut ahead quicker, you'd like to have access to all the citations, it's also available in ebook and paperback on Amazon. Even if reading is not quite your thing and you prefer to listen, buying a copy is a great way to support and is much appreciated. Finally, be sure to like, subscribe, share with friends and family, and most importantly, if you do buy a book, leave a review on Amazon. All of the above help tremendously in getting this information out there and turning the tide on medical tyranny. Now, without further ado, let's begin with Chapter 6, Testing for What? Quote, PCR is just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what it is. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with is really going to hurt you. End quote. Kary Mullis, inventor of polymerase chain reaction, PCR. This is, in my opinion, the most important chapter in this book. In it, we will discuss the basis of the entire COVID era, mass ubiquitous testing. In order to do this, we will begin with the gold standard test, the PCR, and work our way down to other tests which were also used despite having massive faults. There are several glaring issues with PCR which, when taken together, disqualify it as a meaningful method of diagnosing cases. Despite these issues, it was used anyway as the primary tool used to allege a pandemic and to justify all the damage which precedes and follows this chapter. The inventor's disdain for the public health officials in question and their perversion of his method. As can be seen in the preceding quote, Kary Mullis is the inventor of the PCR process. The process itself is a, quote, thermal cycling method used to make up to billions of copies of a specific DNA sample, making it large enough to study, end quote. With uses in a variety of fields from biomedical research to criminal forensics, PCR has been considered a discovery for the ages, earning Mullis a Nobel Prize in 1993. Unfortunately, however, even the most genius of inventions can be subject to misuse. And despite Mullis's death in August 2019, just prior to the first declarations of a pandemic, he was well versed and outspoken on the abuses of his method by those he deemed unfit to use it. Quote, these guys like Fauci get up there and start talking and he doesn't really know anything about anything. And I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and put it under an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus there, you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and he should not be in a position like he's in. Most of those guys up there are just total administrative people, and they don't know anything about what's going on in the body. End quote. Mullis's experience with figureheads like Fauci came during what has turned out to be a very similar situation to today, namely HIV and AIDS. In other interviews, too, he had described his revelations about the weak foundations related to that declared pandemic. For example, Mullis recalled being unable to find a single person or study demonstrating conclusively that HIV truly was the cause of AIDS. According to Mullis, even Luc Montagnier, the person who is credited with discovering HIV, did not have more than a completely unrelated study on monkeys to point him to. As we will demonstrate later, the entire history of public health declared pandemics in general is extremely relevant to what we face today and is necessary background to understand what is happening in context. However, the reasons we must now call attention to Mullis's spat with these institutions during AIDS are as follows. 1. To identify the players and to observe that their ideology is the same now as then. 2. To further demonstrate the stark contrast and observable conflict between those who practice the scientific method, Mullis, Malone, etc., and those who make claims in the name of, quote, science, Fauci, Walensky, etc. And 3, and most importantly in the case of this section, to show conclusively that even though Mullis is not here to object openly to the current abuse of his method, there was clear precedent for the conflict which already existed surrounding it. Indeed, Mullis was well aware of the strengths and weaknesses of his method. One key weakness as it relates to the use of PCR for the detection of infectious disease is called out in the following quote by the inventor himself. Quote, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of in your body, okay? So that can be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. End quote. Focusing on the latter part of the above quote, what Mullis is explaining is that PCR is not a method for demonstrating the quantification of a substance in the body. It can take the substance and make copies for improved observation, but it cannot tell you how much of the thing being observed is actually inside you or what impact it's having on you, if any. The reason this is so relevant in the case of viral illness is that the quantity of viral replication in the body is, theoretically, the thing that determines whether or not you actually become ill. The prevailing theory, germ theory, behind why some viruses ultimately make people sick is that they take over our cells and force those cells to replicate the virus. At the same time, the human body is constantly filled with and exposed to millions of viruses. Fun fact, there are as many as 10 million viruses in a single drop of ocean water. Under normal circumstances, the immune system is able to account for the vast majority of viruses, and so this replication is prevented. However, as you can now imagine, it would not be useful under those normal circumstances for you to simply know whether or not a virus is present. You would only become sick when a virus your immune system fails to fight off is sufficiently replicating, which PCR cannot tell you whether that is or isn't the case. And thanks to the weapon PCR has been made into by ignoring the importance of quantification, people have become conditioned during the COVID pandemic, for the first time in germ theory history, to fear, quote, asymptomatic carriers. Quote, in all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks. The driver of outbreaks is always a symptomatic person, end quote. Anthony Fauci, January 2020. Quote, however, only patients with signs and symptoms consistent with pertussis should be tested by PCR to confirm diagnosis. Testing asymptomatic persons should be avoided as it increases the likelihood of obtaining falsely positive results. Asymptomatic close contacts of confirmed cases should not be tested, and testing of contacts should not be used for post-exposure prophylaxis decisions. End quote. Pre-COVID statement from the CDC. Quote, as the positivity rate of SARS-CoV-2 decreases, the positive predictive value also decreases. This means that the probability that a person who has a positive result, SARS-CoV-2 detected, is truly infected with SARS-CoV-2 decreases as positivity rate decreases, irrespective of the assay specificity. Therefore, healthcare providers are encouraged to take into consideration testing results along with clinical signs and symptoms, confirmed status of any contacts, etc. End quote. Deleted but archived statement from the WHO. As we can see, both the WHO and CDC acknowledged the obvious at one point. An important additional question one might ask about, quote, asymptomatic carriers, however, is as follows. If SARS-CoV-2 is novel, meaning no one would inherently possess immunity to it, and it also causes the disease referred to as COVID, then how can anyone have been an asymptomatic carrier of it? The answer to this is they obviously can't have been, and this implies one of two things. 1. SARS-CoV-2 is not novel and therefore not the cause of the novel disease referred to as COVID. 2. SARS-CoV-2 is novel and is the cause of the novel disease called COVID. This, however, must imply that the PCR tests do not work to a dramatic extent, since the idea of asymptomatic infections with a novel virus is impossible if the germ theory is true. The implications of either possibility are obvious, and the damage caused by public health's ignorance of these logical determinations is extraordinary. Unfortunately, however, the reality of the situation is even worse. The official PCR test calibration used worldwide was riddled with flaws. The conflict between disinterested scientists and the czars of public health has not died out today, despite Mullis's death. The torch has simply been taken up by a new, large swath of those who also practice the scientific method. And this brings us to our next issue as it relates to PCR in the COVID era. On November 27, 2020, a group of 22 scientists submitted an extensive external peer review report to the Eurosurveillance Editorial Board. These scientists came together with a broad range of expertise, including pharmacology, genetics, engineering, molecular andrology, biochemistry, microbiology, cardiology, infectious disease, and immunology. In their report, they acknowledged that the methodology used to calibrate the PCR test came from a January 2020 report most famously attributed to Kristen Drosten called Detection of 2019 Novel Coronavirus, 2019 nCoV, by Real-Time RT-PCR. The Corman-Drosten methodology was ultimately accepted by the WHO and therefore, thanks to the centralization we've discussed before, became an accepted basis for testing globally. So the importance of this one publication cannot be overstated. it was directly responsible for the consequences of actions taken by societies worldwide. The thesis of the external peer review report, however, is that there are a variety of major scientific flaws at the molecular and methodological level with the Corman-Drosten PCR calibration. According to the authors, these flaws lead to misdiagnosis and significant false positive rates. As such, the recommendation of the scientists involved is a retraction of the Corman-Drosten paper by the Eurosurveillance Board. The specific egregious flaws they called out were as follows. 1. The scientists conclude that neither of the two stated aims, i.e. development and deployment of a robust diagnostic methodology, were possible since the tests were developed without any actual virus material. From the external peer review report, quote, the novel coronavirus is based on in silico theoretical sequences supplied by a laboratory in China because at the time, neither controlled material of infectious, live, or inactivated SARS-CoV-2 nor isolated genomic RNA of the virus was available to the authors. To date, no validation has been performed by the authorship based on isolated SARS-CoV-2 viruses or full-length RNA thereof. End quote. A quote cited by the Corman-Drosten report, quote, we aim to develop and deploy robust diagnostic methodology for use in public health laboratory setting without having virus material available. End quote. Before we continue to the remainder of the flaws, I'd like to just reiterate how astounding this point really is. In the words of the calibrators themselves, the PCR test for SARS-CoV-2 was developed, quote, without having virus material available. Please remember, this test was considered the gold standard during the 2 primary years of the COVID era. Without virus material available, it is obviously impossible for the tests to have been accurate. However, another extremely important point is when the external peer reviewers mention, quote, no validation has been performed by the authorship based on isolated SARS-CoV-2 or full-length RNA thereof. If SARS-CoV-2 has been isolated and its entire genome sequenced, which is up for debate as we will come to discuss, it would seem a very logical next step to scrap and or revise the Corman-Drosten report based on this new information. The fact that this never happened is unfathomable to the point of warranting criminal investigation. As someone with computer modeling experience myself, I can attest that it is impossible, not unlikely, impossible, for an actually identified sequence to exactly match a sequence generated theoretically using computer modeling. An exact match would be a miracle of indescribable proportions, and that miracle is what would have needed to have happened for the tests developed on the Corman-Drosten standards to have been accurate. 2. The number of amplification cycles originally recommended by the WHO via the Corman-Drosten report and used by most laboratories in the US and Europe were set far too high, leading to false positive rates of at least 97%. They should have been set no higher than 25 to 30 cycles. From external peer review, quote, in the case of virus detection, greater than 35 cycles only detects signals which do not correlate with infectious virus as determined by isolation in cell culture. Also from the peer review, quote, if someone is tested by PCR as positive when a threshold of 35 cycles or higher is used, as is the case in most laboratories in Europe and the US, the probability that said person is actually infected is less than 3%. The probability that said result is false positive is 97%. End quote. This point is further supported by a 2020 study by Jafar et al. In Clinical Infectious Diseases titled Correlation between 3,790 qPCR positive samples and positive cell cultures, including 1941 SARS-CoV-2, which found that more than 97% of PCR positives were not actually infectious in a cell culture at 35 cycles and more than 80% at 30 cycles. This study showed that it took lowering the CT rate to 25 cycles in order to get even 70% of PCR positives to be infectious in a cell culture, still a 30% false positive rate. And those findings are not even disputed by Anthony Fauci either, who has admitted that, quote, if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. You almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle, even 36. It's just dead nucleoids, period. End quote. If this is true, then how can Fauci not be completely furious and at odds with the FDA and CDC, which, in a document titled CDC 2019 Novel Coronavirus Real-Time RT-PCR Diagnostic Panel declared, quote, A specimen is considered positive for 2019 nCoV if all 2019 nCoV marker cycle threshold growth curves cross the threshold line within 40 cycles. Again, we find ourselves at another astonishing point which needs to be addressed. Anthony Fauci, the figurehead of the COVID era, declared the cycle threshold rates mandated by the FDA and CDC meaningless, yet has not in any way called out those organizations for the obvious scientific fraud that implies. It must be wondered by any reasonable person why this is the case, and whether the answer is fraud or incompetence is irrelevant when it comes to the damage done by errors as egregious as the at least 97% false positive rates identified by the external peer reviewers. But despite our gracious refrain from assuming it, the case for intentional fraud is bolstered by the subsequent actions of those organizations in 2021. One example is the WHO reducing its recommended cycle threshold rate on the U.S. Inauguration Day, just as the COVID mass inoculation program it supported was beginning. Another is the CDC's deleted after pushback spring 2021 notice to reduce PCR cycle threshold rates to 28 in a report about inoculation breakthrough cases. The changing of the methodology used to determine COVID case rates in any way in 2021 without acknowledging the obvious impact this would have had on the 2020 rates, a 97% reduction, is a clear, undeniable fraud. For it to align with the mass inoculation campaign suggests it was intentional, but more on that later. Even the New York Times acknowledged this cycle threshold scandal in their article titled, "Your coronavirus test is positive, maybe it shouldn't be." The article admits, quote, "Most tests set the limit at 40 cycles, a few at 37. A judge in Portugal also officially ruled any PCR tests greater than 25 cycles to be, quote, "totally unreliable," and therefore determined lockdowns to be unlawful. And to further reveal the absurdity of these issues, one need look no further than Tanzania, where a goat and a pawpaw fruit tested positive for COVID-19. 3. The external peer reviewers also found additional issues which disqualify the test as a diagnostic tool. These included extremely high concentration of primers leading to nonspecific bindings, 6 unspecified wobbly positions leading to enormous variability in the real-world laboratory implementations of the test, temperature setting issues, lack of product validation at the molecular level, lack of positive control to evaluate SARS-CoV-2 specifically or negative control to exclude other coronaviruses, and lack of standardization in test design. For a fourth issue, the peer reviewers also found the test cannot discriminate between the whole virus and viral fragments. These are more crucial details about the PCR protocol that bear repeating. The Corman-Drosten PCR protocol accepted by the WHO and used to establish the pandemic does not test for the novel coronavirus. It does not differentiate between specific SARS viruses and also does not test for whole virus at all, but rather for genetic material that is claimed to make up a fragment of the virus. This, however, is still not even a believable premise, considering the virus the Corman-Drosten report is based on was determined theoretically by a Chinese laboratory, as we've discussed previously. A fifth point from the review. The Corman-Drosten report was not otherwise peer-reviewed despite the magnitude of its importance and the fact that peer review is a common, necessary practice. Version 1-0 of the protocol was published at the official WHO website on January 13, 2020, which was updated to version 2-1 on January 17, 2020. This version was then submitted to Eurosurveillance on January 21, 2020, accepted for publication on January 22, 2020, and published on January 23, 2020. In the opinion of the external peer reviewers, the Corman-Drosten report was therefore not at the time peer-reviewed and would not have been considered worthy of publishing if it had been. A sixth point by their external peer reviewers includes significant conflicts of interest. For example, 2 of the authors of the Corman-Drosten paper, Kristen Drosten and Chantal Ruskin, are also members of the editorial board of Eurosurveillance. This severe conflict of interest strengthens suspicions the paper was not peer-reviewed and further compromises its scientific integrity. Both Victor Corman and Kristen Drosten also failed to mention their additional affiliation with the commercial test laboratory Labor Berlin, where they are responsible for virus diagnostics related to real-time PCR testing. This is extremely troubling when considering Drosten's position on the editorial board of Eurosurveillance. Finally, 2 separate contributors' conflicts of interest were added in July 2020, which were not included in the original published version of the report, and include conflicts with TIB Malbial, the first company to produce PCR kits based on the protocol published in the Corman-Drosten report. In summary, this is a scandal of epic proportions on which the entire alleged pandemic was based. While I focus on Fauci's words in this book because I am American, Kristen Drosten of Germany should receive an equal amount of scrutiny for the way his dishonest behavior mirrors Fauci's. The following excerpt from a Wirtschaftswoche interview Drosten did in 2014 is particularly telling as far as his culpability goes. Quote, "Yes, but the method, PCR, is so sensitive that it can detect a single genetic molecule of this virus. For example, if such a pathogen scurries across the nasal mucosa of a nurse for a day without her becoming ill or noticing anything else, then she is suddenly a MERS case. Where previously terminally ill people were reported, mild cases in people who are actually perfectly healthy are now suddenly included in the reporting statistics. This could also explain the explosion in the number of cases in Saudi Arabia. On top of that, the local media made the matter unbelievably high. There is hardly any other topic in the TV news or daily newspapers in the region, and doctors and hospitals are also consumers of this news. They then also consider that they should keep an eye on this disease, which has also been very rare in Saudi Arabia up to now. Medicine is not free of fads. I fear that the current increase in MERS cases and deaths is more due to the increased attention. It's no different in this country. If Bild or the Evening News reports about an outbreak of a certain virus, the number of laboratory tests increases significantly. Simply because doctors are then also sensitized and look out specifically for the pathogens that are being reported on. It would be very helpful if the authorities in Saudi Arabia would go back to using the previous definitions of the disease. Because what interests us first are the real cases. I think it is questionable whether hospital staff who are asymptomatic or mildly infected are really virus carriers. Even more questionable is whether they can pass the virus on to others. The advisory team of the new health minister should distinguish more clearly between medically necessary diagnostics and scientific interest." End quote. Kristen Drosten knew in 2014 that PCR tests would be oversensitive. Kristen Drosten knew in 2014 that such testing would lead to the false diagnosis of asymptomatic people who he knew would not be infectious. Kristen Drosten knew that the explosion of testing would lead to a vicious cycle of media hype. Kristen Drosten knew that doctors would follow the hype of the, quote, fad and would be, quote, sensitized enough by it to encourage testing. Kristen Drosten knew none of this was helpful to public health. In 2020, Kristen Drosten developed a PCR test anyway, based on a theoretical virus, and set the cycle threshold rate such that it would be excessively sensitive. In the report in which he developed this test, he failed to disclose a conflict of interest with a commercial test laboratory responsible for diagnostics. There is perhaps no one in the entire world outside of Anthony Fauci himself with the type of means, motive, and opportunity that Kristen Drosten had as far as knowing how a pandemic could be manufactured and how to profit from it. We will cover much more on Drosten later, but the 180-degree heel turn he made in the COVID era to hysterical endorsement of mass testing paints an ugly picture about who this man is. PCR pseudo-epidemic historical precedent, the whooping cough. The New York Times published a story in 2007 called "Faith in Quick Tests Leads to Epidemic That Wasn't." The story featured Dr. Brooke Herndon of the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, who at the time experienced a ceaseless cough. When some of Dr. Herndon's colleagues began coughing as well, an outbreak of whooping cough was theorized and panic ensued. Writer Gina Collada explains, quote, "Nearly 1,000 healthcare workers at the hospital in Lebanon, New Hampshire, were given a preliminary test and furloughed from work until their results were in. 142 people, including Dr. Herndon, were told they appeared to have the disease, and thousands were given antibiotics and a vaccine for protection. Hospital beds were taken out of commission, including some in intensive care. Then, about 8 months later, healthcare workers were dumbfounded to receive an email message from the hospital administration informing them that the whole thing was a false alarm. Not a single case of whooping cough was confirmed with the definitive test growing the bacterium Bordetella pertussis in the laboratory. Instead, it appears the healthcare workers probably were afflicted with ordinary respiratory diseases like the common cold." End quote. Is this beginning to sound familiar at all? If not, think quick test. Yes, these quick tests, PCR tests, are acknowledged by scientists to have, quote, led them astray in the curious case of the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center. In fact, it led them so far astray that 15% of the people in question, the 142 they told had disease, were falsely diagnosed, mistreated, and even inoculated, all prior to the revelation that the entire thing was a mistake. This is the reality of PCR tests. This is our reality today. And unfortunately, according to Collada, the infectious disease experts responsible seem to admit they are fine with the outlandish risk this presents, as these quick tests, quote, may be the only way to get a quick answer in diagnosing diseases like whooping cough, legionnaires, bird flu, tuberculosis, and SARS, and deciding whether an epidemic is underway, end quote. So we ask again, why is it more important to determine there's an epidemic quickly than to be certain the decision to do so is accurate at all, given the consequences of being wrong include misdiagnosis, mistreatment, and unnecessary illness-causing stress and fear? And what if, as in the case of the Dartmouth Medical Center, among others, the decision is 100% wrong? Well, so be it, I guess. In fact, according to Dr. Trish M. Pearl, an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins and past president of the Society of Healthcare Epidemiologists of America, quote, pseudo-epidemics happen all the time because of such testing. Pearl adds, quote, it's a problem, she admits. We know it's a problem. My guess is that what happened at Dartmouth is going to become common, end quote. The article continues by explaining why it will become common, with the acknowledgement that these tests are considered quick but technically demanding. Collada points out, in fact, there is so much variability in how laboratories may use them that they are referred to as homebrews, are not commercially available, and there's no good estimates, until now, thanks to the external peer reviewers, of their error rates. Because of this, Dr. Pearl admits, quote, at face value, obviously they shouldn't be doing it, but that they continue to because other options take too long or are harder to carry out. Astonishment does not begin to describe my feeling towards this idea that because the alternatives are harder, these people choose to do the thing they know could lead them entirely astray. And even though they know it can lead them entirely astray, they have no idea how often it can do so, and they assume very often. And even though they have no idea how often, and they assume very often, they aren't spending the entirety of their time figuring out how often so they could potentially prevent disasters, potentially global disasters, perhaps where everyone in the entire world meets the same fate or worse, as we will clearly show, as the Dartmouth Medical Center. The CDC withdraws its request for its PCR emergency use protocol. In February of 2020, the CDC requested an emergency use authorization from the FDA to use the aforementioned PCR testing methodology for diagnosing COVID-19. An EUA is a special type of approval which the FDA grants during an emergency for unapproved products. We've already seen the problem this lack of scrutiny presents in the aforementioned external peer review and Dartmouth Medical Center example. But to really bring the lack of accountability, intellectual rigor, and/or honesty full circle, the following is a July 21, 2021 release the CDC posted related to this EUA. Quote, after December 31st, 2021, CDC will withdraw the request to the U.S. FDA for emergency use authorization of the CDC 2019 Novel Coronavirus Real-Time RT-PCR Diagnostic Panel, the assay first introduced in February 2020 for detection of SARS-CoV-2 only, end quote. As you can see above, approval was not granted for this gold standard methodology. In fact, 2 years later, it's not even being sought out. Instead, the CDC is simply withdrawing the test it used the entire time and letting any potentially accurate testing be someone else's problem now that the deed is done and the inoculations, which don't you worry, we will get to, are in the arms of hundreds of millions of people. And is the CDC going to do a post-mortem in determining how wrong it was in diagnosing a pandemic using an unapprovable test? Of course it isn't. To make matters worse, after 2 years of using these tests, within hours of this withdrawal coming to fruition at the very end of 2021, Walensky admitted that, quote, what we do know is the PCR test after infection can be positive for up to 12 weeks, end quote. To put that into context, Walensky is claiming you could have been sick, tested 3 months later, and still have been told you were sick and needed to quarantine yourself if you chose to do that at all. And a brief quarantine was hardly the only consequence as well. The CDC itself publicly acknowledged the potential for the harms they were causing on a tremendous scale via these false positives in a December 2020 fact sheet for healthcare providers. Quote, "In the event of a false positive result, risk to patients could include the following: a recommendation for isolation of the patient, monitoring of household or other close contacts for symptoms, patient isolation that might limit contact with family or friends and may increase contact with other potentially COVID-19 patients, limits in the ability to work, delayed diagnosis and treatment of the true infection causing the symptoms, unnecessary prescription of a treatment or therapy, or other unintended adverse effects." End quote. The implications this 12-week window has on every action taken the entire time are astounding. The implications it has on case and death counts are even more astounding, but we will save that for next chapter. The bottom line is these insane, nonsensical results are not surprising to us at all, given what we know about both PCR in general and how it was developed specific to the COVID era. But 2 years and an unprecedented power grab, including the assumption of domain over leases later, Walensky is still permitted to either feign or act out incompetence on this matter and every other matter with which she is involved. Yet, this slinking away isn't even the best part of the withdrawal post in question. For those who lived during the alleged pandemic, an astute question many raised was, but what happened to the flu? This question, which, not to repeat myself, but we will get to, came as case rates for the same symptom-causing flu mysteriously dropped to near zero, just as COVID cases raised to pre-COVID era flu case rates. Well, the CDC provides the obvious answer for this mystery in their PCR EUA withdrawal post. Quote, "CDC encourages laboratories to consider adoption of a multiplexed method that can facilitate detection and differentiation of SARS-CoV-2 and influenza virus. Such assays can facilitate continued testing for both influenza and SARS-CoV-2 and can save both time and resources as we head into influenza season." End quote. In the words of Porky Pig, that's all, folks. There it is, the money shot. The CDC recommends that on a go-forward basis, laboratories differentiate between influenza and SARS-CoV-2. Now that we head into influenza season, after we ignored the last 2 influenza seasons, whoopsie, it's finally time to start differentiating since we clearly weren't before and everyone knows it. Oh well, another day, another fraud for the CDC. But wait, what's that sound? It's a turd. It's a plane crashing to Earth in a disastrous inferno. No, it's the fact checkers. As always, the public relations team sprang into action to sweep this disaster under the rug, claiming that the CDC, the narrative, actually meant that PCR tests themselves can't differentiate between the two, cold and flu, but also that they could not confuse the two. So the recommendation, they claim, was for someone out there to therefore develop tests which can test for both. However, this implies what we already know and what Kristen Drosten confirmed in his 2014 interview, namely that the obsession the CDC helped foster with the new fad disease led to a 2-year hiatus of testing for flu. So, according to the CDC's media PR team, the CDC is recommending that hiatus come to an end. Now, instead of strictly testing for a portion of the genetic material of a theoretical virus sequence which wasn't based on an isolated novel coronavirus at all, they recommend using a test which can also test for both whatever that is, as well as the flu. Unfortunately, this also fell apart within days of suggesting it with the unironic, ever-convenient introduction of Flu-Rona. Flu-Rona, which the Cleveland Clinic decided to acknowledge was a thing in January 2022, is when a person tests positive with both a flu test and a COVID test. If a person can have both the flu and SARS-CoV-2, however, then the allegation that the CDC COVID PCR test couldn't mistake COVID for the flu is irrelevant. And even if said allegation was true, the COVID era still could have been a seasonal flu with the overutilized PCR simply identifying some other genetic material that also happened to be present. In simpler terms, it just as easily could have been Flu-Rona, the flu, the whole time. A summary of the PCR testing disaster. At this point, we've covered and established the unreliability of the gold standard test, the PCR. we found the following about this method. It is not actually a test for viral infection and could be, at best, a supplemental tool when it comes to diagnosis. It should not be used for the purposes of diagnosis at all. When it is used, it must follow very specific criteria related to cycle rates, primers, temperatures, etc., and should be limited in its scope. The COVID PCR test developed could not differentiate between SARS-CoV-2 and other coronaviruses. They also could not identify influenza viruses, and their overuse led to a hiatus of flu testing. The criteria which needed to be followed were not followed when the protocol for PCR related to SARS-CoV-2 was developed. Instead, cycle rates were set extremely high, which yielded results with at least 97% false positives, among many other issues. PCR has been incorrectly used in the recent past to falsely identify a pseudo-epidemic related to whooping cough, and we've heard a leading epidemiologist declaration at the time that such instances would become common because of PCR. Those behind this malfeasance have not assessed or admitted to the error of their ways, have demonstrated deceitful behavior, and many have glaring conflicts of interest. And finally, the CDC has confirmed a scheduled December 31st, 2021 withdrawal of the request it made to the FDA for the EUA it has secured since February 2020 for its RT-PCR diagnostic panel, which will then make the test unapproved as a diagnostic for SARS-CoV-2 infection. All of this together presents a troubling picture, to say the least, when considering the implications of how ubiquitous the PCR test has been in the lives of billions of people during the COVID era. By 2022, the CDC even came out and admitted that there is a 10% chance the PCR test a given person took ended up in a lab for genomic sequencing analysis, which raises a whole series of ethical questions about consent the CDC will be happy to never answer. In the next chapter, we will also discuss the impact of false positives on case and death counts. For now, though, we will round out this chapter by looking at the other tests used despite known and admitted faults. Because as hard to believe as it might be that things got even sloppier than the Korman-Drosten PCR test, they absolutely did. Antigen tests. The use of the phrase gold standard as it relates to PCR can give us some insight into just how careless the CDC was in allowing tests to be used which were not up to said standard. The first example of this is the antigen test. The antigen test is another emergency use authorized test which is meant to detect proteins related to SARS-CoV-2. In November 2020, the FDA released a letter to healthcare providers specifically to call out the potential for false positives in those tests. Per the FDA, quote, "Remember that positive predictive value, PPV, varies with disease prevalence when interpreting results from diagnostic tests. PPV is the percent of positive results that are true positives. As disease prevalence decreases, the percent of test results that are false positives increase. At 0.1% prevalence, the PPV would only be 4%, meaning that 96 out of 100 positive results would be false positives." End quote. Considering the already enormous false positive rates we've touched on related to the PCR tests and the extremely low prevalence of the vast majority of communities using these tests when the alleged pandemic began, this acknowledgement sets off some obvious alarm bells. Just how exaggerated must such a test be for it to demonstrate worse results than a test as poorly calibrated as the COVID PCR? It's hard to imagine, but it didn't stop such tests from being used in reporting and telling people in news feeds how scared they should be. In fact, the entire Omicron variant narrative of early 2022 was built on the back of mass antigen testing. This came at the very time the CDC's PCR test was being withdrawn during a variant scare which had incredibly low disease prevalence. Despite this low disease prevalence, the hysteria reached an all-time high, and testing went through the roof, thanks in large part to the Biden regime's outrageous fear-mongering and buying up 500 million of such tests at a cost of $4 billion, according to Fox News. Almost half of those tests went unclaimed, but corruption seems a primary function of the government at this point, and this was just one tiny drop in an ocean of it relatively. As the FDA outlined, the low disease prevalence led to a false positivity rate that saw the biggest case spike in the entire COVID era, yet the least actual disease and death. While people attributed this to the allegedly mild characteristics of the Omicron variant, this assumption is a category of the mind. It is a narrative which has been fit to a predictable outcome. Not predictable because of assumptions about the nature of submicroscopic particles, but rather because of phenomena which can much more directly be attributed to the FDA-attributed faults of rapid antigen testing and associated PPV. But people who were worried and tested anyway despite the lack of symptoms mainly did so with the goal of knowing whether or not to quarantine themselves so as not to get those around them sick. The problem is, as antigen tests become the predominant test in use, even Anthony Fauci admitted they don't tell you if you're transmissible. Quote, "The only way you can tell if it's transmissible, if you can show that there is really live replication and virus in you, and the tests don't measure that. They measure the presence or absence of the virus, and the virus could be a dead inactive virus that doesn't transmit. So it's entirely understandable how people can get confused over that." End quote. You don't say. Again, considering how many people have accepted this lie and pointless exercise of asymptomatic infection, if the testing doesn't end, this irrational behavior will never end. Every cold flu season, there would be an increasing wave of people getting tested and a subsequent wave of positive tests. Whether it's flu-rona or the fact that the same test can show positive for all the different variants, without any recalibration, the tests are equally meaningless and tell you nothing. But pretending otherwise is a lifestyle choice many people have made for themselves. We will have to see if in the future their submission to this testing regimen and the irrational self-inflicted harms which result from it continue. Either way, the reason you would get screened for an illness is to inform a treatment decision. For example, if I found a lump on my body, I wouldn't want to get chemotherapy, surgery, and/or radiation if it ended up being a cyst. So I would need to find out whether or not it was cancerous. COVID tests were not used for this purpose at all. Instead, they were used to lock oneself inside, sick or not, and to avoid all human contact. And for those who were sick, early treatments were not even permitted by the public health organizations, but more on that to come. The CDC used antibody tests to count COVID cases. In May of 2020, The Atlantic published a story titled, "How Could the CDC Make That Mistake?" On the one hand, what is most surprising about this article is that the writers at The Atlantic seem surprised the CDC would do something that doesn't make any scientific sense. On the other hand, they do acknowledge yet another scandal which took place during the height of the alleged pandemic's opening days. This scandal is related to antibody tests and how the CDC and several states did not differentiate between them when reporting infection numbers. An antibody test per the FDA is used to identify the antibodies associated with a virus to determine if an individual has had a past infection. Having antibodies does not in any way suggest you are infected with a virus. In fact, as it relates to COVID, the FDA even admits, quote, "Researchers do not know whether the presence of antibodies means that you are immune to COVID-19. End quote. Also, in their question and answer section on these tests, they further clarify that antibody tests may detect coronavirus antibodies other than SARS-CoV-2, such as those that cause the common cold. One should be able to easily then make the logical leap that antibody tests are 1. Worthless as it relates to telling you anything about your potential past experience with the alleged novel coronavirus specifically, 2. Worthless as it relates to measuring current allegedly novel coronavirus infection rates, 3. Worthless as it relates to your potential immunity, the entire point, and 4. Just plain worthless. Actually, to clarify, using antibody tests to measure current novel coronavirus infection rates is not just worthless, but rather is fraudulent. Yet, as The Atlantic points out, this is exactly what the CDC admitted to doing through at least May 2020. And this is why when people call COVID the common cold, they are literally not wrong. Not just because the common cold is from the same family of viruses as the alleged novel coronavirus, but also because the tests, as we've seen previously, even the gold standard PCR, don't even differentiate between them. Atlantic writers Alexis C. Madrigal and Robinson Meyer point out as well how debilitating this mistake was, as states had, quote, set quantitative guidelines for reopening their economies based on these flawed data points, end quote. To further illustrate the utter incompetence and negligence of the people taking actions as impactful as closing economies during this time, Vermont authorities responded to The Atlantic by claiming they, quote, didn't even know they were doing this, end quote. And as for the CDC's part, not only did they fail to prevent or call out this mistake, but they too confirmed it as their practice when asked. Ashish Jha K.T. Lee, professor of global health at Harvard and the director of the Harvard Global Health Institute, was bewildered by this failure. Quote, "You've got to be kidding me. How could the CDC make that mistake? This is a mess," end quote. Professor Jha poses a great question. Here are some more. To what extent did this conflation exaggerate already exaggerated case and death counts? How much fear did it produce? How much unnecessary destruction did it cause based on the foolish decision-making it inspired? Why did no one publicly correct it and apologize for it? These are the questions that organizations like the CDC, WHO, FDA, and NIH never seem to have to answer for. They're questions which should be demanded of them and which should lead to firings and/or investigations, but are instead ignored no matter how many distinct times they arise.